Okay, so let's get started. We are looking at the learning theory of attachment. And there are two main explanations for attachment that you need to know according to the specification. But we're focused on the learning theory. And in terms of our lesson aims, we want to be able to describe how the learning theory explains attachment and apply theories of classical conditioning and operant conditioning to attachment behavior. And there's also a third element, which we'll look at very briefly, being the social learning theory. And what you'll find is with the learning theory of attachment, there's certainly strong overlap with what you've covered in approaches concerning the behaviourist approach of human behaviour. I've put a starter video there, and I'm just going to ask you, perhaps at the end of the lesson, you can have a watch of this particular video, which one of my year 13s, I think 2 years ago, created, summarising the behaviourist explanation of phobias. And you might find it useful as part of your own psychopathology revision as well. So classical conditioning was proposed by Pavlov, and it's this idea that we learn by association. We make connections between different experiences, and that literally guides and earmarks our future behaviors. He conducted research on the salivation reflex in dogs. So just a few key words for classical conditioning in psychology. A stimulus is any change in the environment that an organism registers. So for example, if wherever you are right now, one of your siblings or your mum or your dad just came and pinched you, that would be a stimulus in your environment, and you certainly would register that. So you might respond to it by saying, ow. Your response is any behavior that the organism emits as a consequence of a stimulus. And a reflex is a consistent unlearned connection between stimulus and a response. I want to stress on this word unlearned. The reason it's unlearned is that you are not taught to respond in that way. It's something that is innate. So a good example is, I've got candles here. I love scented candles. And when it's lit, if I put my hand on the fire, no one has taught me that when it gets too hot, I need to pull my hand away. It's a reflex that I automatically pull my hand away. Or if you touch a sharp object by accident, it's a reflex that you pull your hand away. No one has taught you, oh, you must pull your hand away at this particular speed when you encounter danger. So that's what we mean by reflex. Looking at Pavlov's dog, I've got Scooby-Doo, the dog. I can't even remember his name. Maybe his name is actually Scooby. I think it is Scooby. But yeah, we've got the dog from Scooby-Doo. And think about his food. So Scooby snacks would be the unconditioned stimulus. It's something that's in his environment. And the way he responds is through producing saliva. It's an unconditioned response. By unconditioned, we mean that it's unlearned. It's something that is automatic. The bell produces no response. The bell is a neutral stimulus. It has no consequence, of no real use to Scooby. But when it comes to classical conditioning, we know that if you were to pair the bell with the presence of food, the dog is going to drool. The dog is going to produce that unconditioned response of salivation primarily to the food. But repeated pairings of the bell and the food, so if you constantly pair bell, food, eventually it's going to get to the point where Scooby learns that just the presence of the bell means that I can really expect food is coming, and I'm going to salivate just because the bell has become my conditioned stimulus. In the same way, classical conditioning in attachment follows a very similar format. And before we look at a visual diagram for that, I just want to quickly outline the process using bullet points. So an infant is born with innate reflex responses, meaning that these are unlearned responses and they are born with it, so it's innate. The unconditioned stimulus, food, produces a sense of pleasure, which is an unconditioned response. And that pleasure in a baby can be them smiling, them drooling, and we know that babies love to drool. The primary caregiver is the neutral stimulus. So the presence of the mother doesn't really move the child in any particular way. They don't offer any response to the primary caregiver. However, what happens is that when the person, so neutral stimulus, the primary caregiver, producing or providing the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, If they're constantly paired, eventually the baby's going to produce the response of pleasure, which is an unconditioned response. After repeated pairing of the primary caregiver and the presence of food, the provider of the food alone becomes the conditioned stimulus. And that conditioned stimulus means that they produce a conditioned response in the baby, being pleasure. And as a consequence, the learning theory of attachment, specifically classical conditioning, says that the baby attaches to the mother as she is the provider of food. It could also be that the baby attaches to the father as they might be the primary provider of food. The baby has learned through association that the mother brings pleasure. So let's have a visual outline. You've got food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, and it produces the unconditioned response of happiness in the baby. You've got the mother, who is the neutral stimulus. And if we wanted to add another step just before this one here, we could just put neutral stimulus, no response. The mother alone would produce no response from the baby. However, if you pair the mother with food multiple times, eventually the baby's going to produce this unconditioned response of happiness. That repeated pairing process means that you no longer need the presence of food to produce happiness in the baby. The baby has learned to associate the mother with that feeling of pleasure. So therefore, the mother becomes the conditioned stimulus, and that conditioned stimulus produces a conditioned response of happiness in the baby. Notice the difference that here we've got unconditioned, meaning that it's unlearned. But in this particular stage, it's conditioned, meaning that the baby has learned through association to associate the mother with food, and that association has caused them to produce a response of happiness. I hope this is nice and clear for everyone. Before we move on to operant conditioning, are there any questions on classical conditioning? Brilliant. I'm assuming there's no questions, so we move on. Then we have operant conditioning, and operant conditioning was put forward by Skinner. And the tagline for operant conditioning is that you learn by reinforcement, or you learn by consequences. Now, what Skinner did is he placed hungry rats in cages, known as Skinner's boxes, to explore their surroundings. And when the rat accidentally pressed a lever, the lever that provided the food, it quickly learned that, okay, every time I press this lever, I'm going to get the food. So as a result, the food was that rewarding factor, and they realized that the consequence of pressing this lever is I'm going to get food, and that food is going to suppress all hunger that I previously experienced. Some definitions for operant conditioning. Firstly, we have reinforcement, and reinforcement is our broad term to outline that anything which has the effect of increasing the likelihood of the behavior being repeated. So anything that reinforces a particular behavior. Then there are two types of reinforcement. We've got positive reinforcement. So anything which has the effect of increasing the likelihood of the behavior being repeated by using consequences that are pleasant. In other words, the consequences are positive. So a good example would be if a student completes their homework and I give them £5, that £5 is a positive reward. So it's a positive reinforcement. It means that that student is more likely to complete their homework. I'm not giving you guys £5, by the way. But a negative reinforcement, in contrast, and I really want you to pay attention to this because students often confuse negative reinforcement with punishment, and it's really not punishment. So I'll quickly read it. Negative reinforcement. These are behaviors that switch off something unpleasant, and they are also likely to be repeated. So for example, if crying switches off separation anxiety because the primary caregiver appears, then crying is likely to be repeated. I'm just going to elaborate on that example in the context of attachment. When a baby is separated from their primary caregiver, they experience the unpleasant feeling of feeling anxious. The baby then cries, and as a result of their crying, the primary caregiver appears, and all of a sudden that separation anxiety is removed. The mother's presence or the father's presence has switched off the unpleasant feeling of separation anxiety, and that's what we would call negative reinforcement. In contrast, you've got punishment. And punishment is any behavior that leads to an unpleasant outcome. And these type of behaviors are less likely to be repeated. So, for example, if every time you fail to complete your homework, I ask you to give me £5 for our psychology no homework fund, it would mean that that unpleasant outcome means that you are less likely to repeat the behavior of not completing your homework. And that would be a punishment. So how can attachment be explained using operant conditioning? Well, I used an example when I was talking about negative reinforcement there. But let's have a look at a few others. So look at Cameron. Cameron is very, very upset. He's hungry and he performs various behaviors such as crying. After crying, Cameron, his mother, then appears with food. Cameron realizes that anytime he wants his mother, anytime he needs to reduce that drive of hunger, he can just cry. So he says, well, I'm going to do that again. And the mum appears with food. And we can see that he's learned that his behavior, i.e. crying, has produced some sort of consequence that is beneficial to him, and he's learned to repeat that particular behavior. And of course, we know babies can be quite manipulative. The older they get, parents will know that actually the type of cry that this baby is crying is not a cry of I'm hungry, it's just a cry of I need attention, or it's a fake cry. But there are babies who, of course, when they're much younger, they genuinely are crying because they're hungry. Now, the learning theory explanation is also known as the cupboard love theory of attachment, because it suggests that attachment is based on the provision of food alone. And I really want you to remember this. I really want to stress this. The learning theory, if you were to just summarize it in a sentence, the learning theory says that infants attach to their primary caregiver because of food. End of. Yeah? And it's also known as cupboard love, and you can use that term. Researchers known as Dollard and Miller combined both classical conditioning and operant conditioning to explain infants' attachment in terms of food. Operant conditioning, just to give you a recap, they are reinforced in the behaviors that will produce desirable responses because they learn through consequences, they learn through reinforcement. Classical conditioning, the infants, they learn to associate the caregiver with a feeling of pleasure when they are fed. And the combination of these two is known as cupboard love. And let me take you through the process of the cupboard love explanation as by Dollard and Miller, 1950. So remember, this is a combination of both operant and classical conditioning. So imagine a hungry infant feels uncomfortable, and this creates a drive to reduce this discomfort. When an infant is fed, the discomfort is reduced and feelings of pleasure are produced, which is rewarding. Food becomes a primary reinforcer as it reduces the discomfort. The person who supplies the food is associated with avoiding discomfort, and they become the secondary reinforcer. And notice the word association here to really emphasize the classical conditioning explanation. Attachment occurs because the child seeks the person who can supply the rewards. Settling a crying baby through feeding, cuddling, acts as negative reinforcement from the parent because they are removing or switching off something unpleasant. And here you've got an example of operant conditioning. So up here we had classical conditioning, down here we've got operant. The final branch of the learning theory explanation of attachment comes from the social learning theory. And this suggests that we learn through observation. So far, we've looked at classical conditioning, we learn through association. We've looked at operant conditioning, we learn through reinforcement or consequences. The social learning theory says that we learn through observing. And there are different stages for the social learning theory. So within the social learning theory, you always have a role model. This is the person who is performing the behavior that you are observing. And for an infant, their role model could be their parents. You identify with the role model, and it could be that you identify with them because they are within your family. They could be the same age as you. They could be the same gender as you. There's just something that connects you and this role model that encourages that identification process. Then we have observation, and this is where you are intentionally watching their behavior. You are literally looking at them. Vicarious reinforcement is a type of reinforcement that occurs when you are observing someone, in this case, you're observing your role model, receive a reward for a behavior that they have performed. You then become vicariously reinforced to repeat the same behavior that caused them to get that reward. So I give you a very lazy example. If you see somebody who has just got their hair done and they've got the most stylish braids, there's lots of colors and jewels in their hair, and you see them receive a compliment for their hairstyle, you could receive some sort of vicarious reinforcement in that you say, well, I want to get that same hairstyle because I want the reward of compliments. And the social learning theory can be used in any context. It can be used in a positive context and also negative context as well. So when we look at forensic psychology later on, we will see how the social learning theory can also explain why people engage in criminal behavior. Then there's imitation. So after you experience that vicarious reinforcement, that desire to receive the same rewards that you observed your role model receiving, you literally imitate their behavior in order to receive that same reward. And after imitating their behavior, it's very likely that you will receive the same consequences. So following my example of doing your hair in the same way that you saw someone else receiving compliments for, you then will receive compliments, and that reinforces your behavior as well. And then finally, internalization, it will get to the point that the behavior you've observed and you've imitated now becomes a part of you. You internalize it so that it's a part of your personality, and it's just how you do things. So then we have to ask ourselves, so how can this whole process be used to explain attachment? So the social learning theory emphasizes the role of imitation. We watch others, and if they are rewarded for their behavior, we are likely to copy it ourselves. And it's this part, we are likely to copy it ourselves, that relates to vicarious reinforcement. This can be achieved in three ways. So the first way, modeling. Children copy the affectionate behavior that they see between their parents. The second way, direct instruction. Parents teach their children to be affectionate. And number three, social facilitation. Parents watch their children and encourage appropriate behaviors. So that first part, modeling, if the parents are in a loving relationship and the infant sees their parents kiss each other or hug each other, the infant watching their primary caregivers engage in such loving behaviors, they may feel vicariously reinforced to imitate those same behaviors in order to receive the reward of comfort and pleasure. Direct instruction, I'm sure many of you have been in situations where maybe your grandma or your mom or your dad says, come here and let's have a hug, or come here, let me hold your hands, or come and give me a kiss on the cheek, or whatever the case might be. That is your role model, according to the social learning theory, teaching you, telling you how you ought to behave. And then social facilitation, when the mother or father or any primary caregiver is watching the infant and encouraging them to produce appropriate behaviors. Okay, so let's have a look at this application exam question. You're not going to answer it because I've got a model answer on the next slide, but I just want to get you thinking about how these type of questions can come up in relation to the learning theory of attachment. So let's read it together. It says, when Max was born, his mother gave up work to stay at home and look after him. Max's father works long hours and does not have much to do with the day-to-day care of his son. Max is now 9 months old, and he seems to have a very close bond with his mother. And the question is, use learning theory to explain how Max became attached to his mother rather than to his father. And it's a 6-mark question. And remember, because this question is giving you a stem, it's so important that in your answer, you always refer, you can quote parts of the stem to support the fact that you've actually read the question and support the fact that you are able to apply your knowledge of psychological theory to novel scenarios. So let's have a look at the example answer here. Learning theory suggests attachment develops through classical and operant conditioning and social learning theory. So notice how in this first sentence, the answer starts off very broadly saying these are the three key areas of the learning theory. You're demonstrating that you actually know your stuff. According to classical conditioning, food, the unconditioned stimulus, produces pleasure, the unconditioned response. Max's mother was associated with the food and becomes a conditioned stimulus that produces the conditioned response of pleasure for Max. So a lovely outline of classical conditioning. And see how the outline isn't just one, textbook outline. They've literally included Max's name, referred to the mother, showing that they have read the question. Now, when Max sees his mother, he experiences pleasure. According to operant conditioning, the day-to-day provision of food by his mum will satisfy Max's hunger and make him feel comfortable again. Drive reduction. Food is therefore a primary reinforcer. His mother was associated with food and became a secondary reinforcer. Max became attached to his mother because she was a source of reward, and not to his father because he was not actively involved in the provision of food due to work, as the stem implies. And there's again a lovely plug from the stem here. And then finally, some reference to the social learning theory. So social learning theory could be applied as perhaps Max's mother is more of a role model to him due to being a stay-at-home mum. This means that Max can learn attachment behaviours by observing his mother and imitating her, eventually forming a close attachment with her at 9 months. And you can see here in bold exactly where this model answer has made reference to the stem and applied all three areas of learning theory to the situation of Max and his mother and his father. And this is just an example of the mark scheme. So we would certainly say that that answer is within this top band. The answer offers an effective explanation of Max's attachment according to learning theory. The selection and application of psychological knowledge is appropriate and effective. Now I want you to think back to our study of animal research in attachment. And anytime I think about learning theory, the headline statement for the learning theory of attachment is that we attach because of food. End of. We attach because of food. But then Harlow's research and Lorenz's research would suggest that we don't attach because of food. Harlow would suggest that actually we attach because we desire comfort. He found that the monkeys were always clinging to the cloth-covered surrogate mother as opposed to the wired one, which actually was producing food. Even in instances where the monkey was attached to the one, or was holding on to the one that was producing food, the wired covered one, it would still be clinging very closely onto the cloth-covered monkey. Lorenz would suggest that, we don't attach because of food. We actually attach to the first moving object that we see in our world. So we can see how we can actually use animal research in attachment to contradict a whole theory. And please, I encourage you to do that. You might come across different studies in psychology that can be used to challenge the assumptions of any particular theory of behavior. So I've got a few evaluation points and we'll go through these before we finish. So one weakness of the learning theory. A study that undermines the learning theory explanation of attachment is Harlow's study of rhesus monkeys. Our evidence for this comes from the fact that Harlow separated infant monkeys from their mothers and raised them in isolation. He created two artificial surrogate mothers. One was wired and had a feeding bottle attached, and the other was wrapped in soft cloth, but offered no food. The monkeys spent much of their time clinging to the cloth mother, especially in times of distress. Explanation. This matters because it undermines the learning theory view of attachment. According to the learning theory, the young monkeys should have attached to the wire surrogate monkey, which dispensed food, because they would associate it with a sense of pleasure and the reduction of their hunger drive. However, Harlow's research provides support that attachments are formed for comfort and not food. And you can see how this has been nicely put. As always, we use this matters because, or this is important because. We make sure that we are very thorough when we are outlining our evidence. We don't put half-hearted stuff. We can't just put, oh, a study was conducted by Harlow, full stop, and that's your evidence. Provide additional detail. Let's have a look at another evaluation point. So like I shared earlier, Lorenz found that geese imprinted on their caregivers before being fed and then maintains these attachments. So this cannot be explained by the learning theory, which suggests that we attach primarily because of food. However, and this would be our counter argument, both of these studies by Harlow and Lorenz lack generalizability, as they use animals which are not representative of human attachments. Therefore, the findings cannot be extrapolated to humans. And as always, I would love for you to use this term extrapolated, as it's a strong term, it's fanciful, but it really captures this idea that we can't take a study which has been done on animals to explain human behaviors, because we are fundamentally different, even if we share a certain amount of the same genes. And then I bring you an issue and debate in psychology. And issues and debates is a topic that we cover normally in year 13. And it's this idea that some of the explanations for our behavior can seem very, very reductionist. And by reductionist, we say they're only focusing on one component part or one explanation for behavior. We need a holistic view that considers all the various explanations for any single behavior. So I'll read this. It says the learning theory proposes that attachment develops purely as a result of learning to associate a caregiver with food. This is very simplistic. This explanation is reductionist, as it ignores any evolutionary basis of attachment, such as Bowlby's theory of attachment, which suggests that forming attachments are innate. It also ignores internal cognitive processes and the emotional nature of attachments. This matters because the learning theory of attachment is too simplistic. And I've put a pizza there, and you might be thinking, Miss, why is there pizza on your PowerPoint slide? But it's this idea that, and I think I might have shared this with your group before, but it's this idea that you can have a pizza of many, many slices, and you give someone just one slice, and you ask them to judge the entire pizza as to whether the pizza is good or bad. You can't make a judgment just based on one slice. It could be that the slice that you're giving only has one pepperoni, or there's very limited cheese, you didn't get much of the stuffed crust, and therefore your judgment would be unfounded. In order to make a judgment as to whether the pizza is good or bad, you need to consider eating the entire pizza, and therefore you've got a more holistic evaluation of that pizza. In the same way with human behavior, it would be reductionist to just take the learning theory of attachment as the gold standard for explaining how attachments occur. We must, it's absolutely essential that we considered alternative views, alternative explanations for attachment in order to provide a holistic view on that particular human behavior. I'm hoping this is nice and clear for everyone. If you do have any questions, like I said, please do ask, unmute, put it in the chat. And we continue. So we've got an evaluation from Shafra and Emerson, and then I'll show you a tweet from my friend. So also, Shafra and Emerson, 1964, found that in 39% of cases, the mother was not the baby's main attachment figure, suggesting that feeding is not the primary explanation of attachment, which challenges the learning theory. And this is really strong because we understand that women, mothers, are the ones who are able to breastfeed. The father cannot breastfeed. However, we know that the introduction of formula bottles may muddy the waters in terms of the data here. Attachments are more likely to be formed to those who play with the baby and offer comfort. And this is thought to be more rewarding. So this, again, is a key piece of evidence that you could use to challenge the learning theory of attachment. And I'll show you this tweet from my friend who recently had a baby, and she says, Madam, so that's her little one, has become a daddy's girl. It's so cute to watch, but she remembers me when it's time for milk. And it's just stressing on this point that she remembers her mother when it's time to be fed, but it might be that she's getting more play, not necessarily more comfort. I don't want to assume that is more comfort, but more play, more engagement from the father. And here we would literally just thwart the whole learning theory of attachment and say, well, it doesn't really explain why this particular infant appears to be more attached to the father than the mother, but only remembers the mother when it comes to feeding. And I think this is our last evaluation point before we have this comparison. So our last evaluation point, food or skin-to-skin contact. Could it be that breastfeeding is not the main reason why babies attach to mothers based on the learning theory? It could be that breastfeeding offers skin-to-skin contact. In other words, literally your skin is touching the skin of another person, which could be an additional factor in explaining why babies primarily attach to their mothers. And this is supported by Harlow's rhesus monkeys study. This idea that they wanted their skin to cling onto the skin of the cloth-covered surrogate mother. So just to wrap it up, some of our strengths for the learning theory, it provides an adequate explanation of how attachments form. We're not saying that it's the best explanation, but we're saying it's adequate, it's plausible, and we certainly support the view, and we have got lots of research to support the view that we do learn through association and reinforcement. However, the weaknesses is that there's a strong body of evidence which suggests that attachment is not based on food, but that the attention and responsiveness from the caregiver are more important rewards. And you can take that research done by Shaffer and Emerson, you can take the tweet that my friend kindly shared with us, this idea that babies don't primarily attach because of food. And the learning theory is criticized by two animal studies, Harlow and Lorenz. However, our counter argument would be that because these are animal studies, they don't necessarily tell us much about how humans would behave if they were put in those exact circumstances. So that brings us to the end. What I would like you to do, please, is just in the chat so that I know that I haven't just been talking for 1 hour for no reason. Just in the chat, can you just write 1 or 2 things that you've learned or that have been the most memorable from the lesson? And you can hashtag learning theory as you do that.